We're going to take a look at the taxonomic classification of organisms. So there's a lot of diversity in life, a lot of different species, and that's due to evolution. So currently, biologists have named about 2.5 million different species, and thousands of newly identified species are added each year. And we think that there's probably at least 9 million different species alive on Earth today. And that number could go up to 1 billion different species if we add in all of the different microorganisms that are out there. So we need a way to classify all of these different species that are around. So taxonomy is the science of classifying and naming organisms. And it just uses a system of classification that reflects the evolution of groups of species from their ancestors. And you want to assign species to categories based on their relationship to other species. So here's the hierarchy of taxonomic classification. So if we start up here at the top, domain is the broadest category. So it's going to contain the largest number of species. And then as we go down to kingdom, we're going to get a little bit more narrow. And then as we go down even further, we get to species at the bottom here, and there's only going to be a single organism when we get down to species. So domain would be our broadest category of taxonomic classification. And as we go down, it gets more narrow until we get down to species, and then there's only one organism left when we get to species. So I would know the order of this. So the way I remember this is I just take the first letter of each of these names. And if you just remember, did King Philip come over for good soup? That's a good way to remember the order of this. There is a R-rated version of this, and if it's easier to remember that, that's fine. But if you just remember, did King Philip come over for good soup, then you can just remember what order all of these will go in. So we just start with domain and then go down to kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, and then finally genus and species. So why don't we just use common names when we talk about organisms? Because it's actually a lot easier to say the common names because the scientific names are Latin and they're usually pretty hard to pronounce. So if we take a look at this organism here, and maybe I learned it as a cougar, and somebody else maybe learned it as a mountain lion, and then another area of the country, maybe somebody else calls it, catamount. And maybe somebody else has learned it as a panther or a puma. So there's actually a lot of different common names for this particular species. And if you learned it as a cougar and someone else is calling it a catamount and you've never heard that before, you would probably think you're talking about two totally different species. And so sometimes common names can get pretty confusing, and that's why they came up with these scientific names. All right, so let's start with our broadest taxonomic classification, the domains. There's only 3 domains. So I would definitely know the 3 domains. So the 3 domains are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And you can see on this evolutionary tree or phylogenetic tree, if we start here at the bottom, and as you go up the tree, this is how you read these trees. So you start at the bottom, and at the bottom here would be the last universal common ancestor. So whatever cell this was that gave rise to all the living organisms that are alive today would be at the bottom of the tree at the root. And then as we go up, you can see the first branch that branched off was domain bacteria. So the bacteria were the first to evolve, and so they're going to be the oldest group alive on Earth. So that's the oldest domain. And then as you continue up our tree, the next branch off of our tree is domain archaea. So they're the next oldest. And then as we continue up, the last branch would be domain eukarya. So domain eukarya would be the youngest group. So they're the last to evolve. And how we know that, this is the order, there's a lot of evidence for this. And how we know that these are all related. Well, if we look at their cells under the microscope, we know that the bacteria and archaea are actually prokaryotes. So they don't have a nucleus and no organelles. And then we get to the domain eukarya, and they're eukaryotic cells. So they do have a nucleus and they do have some organelles. So they're more advanced. And we know that, for example, the bacteria and the archaea, they did come up with DNA as their genetic material. They came up with ribosomes to make the proteins, and the eukaryotic cells, they all kept that because they're like, hey, that works and we're going to keep that and continue using that. So they also have DNA and ribosomes. And then they just added in, let's surround our DNA with the membrane and have a nucleus, and then let's make some organelles to do some specialized, jobs in the cell, like mitochondria make ATP or energy and things like that. So there's a lot of evidence for this, that we think that's probably how life evolved with these three different domains. Okay, and then let's just take a look at the kingdoms, the next taxonomic level below domains, and this is in domain eukarya. So we would have kingdom plantae would be the plants, and then kingdom fungi, which would include mushrooms and mold and yeast, and then kingdom animalia, which would be the animals, which we're part of. And then we also have the protists, which they kind of just lumped them all together because they didn't really know what to do with them. And they said, well, these are mostly all unicellular, so we'll just put them all in one group. And now they're being reclassified and kind of moved around right now. So these are all the kingdoms. All right, and here's just a nice picture just showing you the three domains. We have domain bacteria, domain archaea, and you can see the bacteria and archaea look very similar. They're about the same size, but archaea look like bacteria, but they're not bacteria. They're, a little bit different evolutionarily wise. And then here's domain eukarya. So these are all going to be made out of eukaryotic cells. And we've got some different kingdoms here. We've got kingdom plantae, our plants, kingdom fungi, and we've got kingdom animalia here. And then we've got our protists, which mostly are unicellular eukaryotic cells, and they just are kind of reclassifying those right now. Okay, and then we have binomial nomenclature. Binomial just means two names. And so for each organism, we've come up with a scientific name that has two parts. So we have a genus name and a species name. And the scientist that came up with this is Carl Linnaeus. He was a Swedish scientist working in the 1700s. And he decided to come up with the genus and species name because he was getting all confused with the common names that were being used at the time. So he says, well, we've got to do something about this. And so he decided to use the genus and species names. All right, so the genus name is a little bit broader category than the species name. So a lot of times in the genus category, there might be a couple of closely related species grouped together. But then when you get to the last category, the species, there's only one organism there. So when we write our genus and species name, the genus name will be capitalized, but the species name is not. And they're always going to be italicized. So for example, for humans, the scientific name for humans is Homo sapiens, and it literally means wise man. Sometimes I kind of wonder if we're really that wise, but that's what it means. And if you want to abbreviate it, you can abbreviate the genus name, and then they'll just spell out the species name. And then Felis catus, that is the domestic cat, so your pet cats. And then this last one is a bacterium, Escherichia coli or E. coli. And this one, coli, just refers to the colon. So it likes to live in your large intestine, your colon. And then it's also named after the German scientist that discovered it. His last name was Escherich. So that's where that part comes from. Okay, and this just shows the taxonomic classification of dogs. So starting here on the bottom, you can see that they're in domain Eukarya. And then we go to kingdom, they're in kingdom Animalia. And then their phylum is Chordata. Class would be Mammalia. Order Carnivora. Family Canidae. And then genus Canis, and then species Canis lupus. And then because they're so closely related to wolves, they've also got a subspecies. So sometimes you will see like a subspecies or a subphylum or something like that. So they're actually, their scientific name is Canis lupus familiaris, which would be our domestic dog. Okay, and then if you wanted to see the taxonomic classification for humans, that's right here in the middle if you're interested in that.